Hey y'all, welcome back to my channel. My name is Carrie and it's an exciting day on this little corner of the internet where I talk about knitting because we're going to learn all the basics of the knit stitch. One of the things that I find really magical about knitting is that it's all pretty much comprised of two stitches, the purl stitch and the knit stitch. Two stitches can create such an amazing variety of stitch patterns and techniques, and learning how to knit is really just mastering these two stitches. So today we're going to go through all the basics of the knit stitch. If you've been following along in the Knitting Fundamentals series, yay, we're here! We're going to learn how to do our first stitches, the knit stitch. There's a lot of ground to cover because you're going to need some base knowledge in order to kind of dive into this. So today, first, I'm going to go over the anatomy of a stitch and what the structure of knitted fabric is, so you really have an understanding of what it is that you are creating when you're doing your knitting. Then I'm going to give a quick demonstration of different ways that you can knit and an explanation of how I like to teach to knit, my personal style of knitting. It's not my personal style, I didn't invent it, but it is how I like to knit most. So then we will finally dive into actually how to do the knit stitch itself. Yes, you're gonna do some knit stitches, so don't worry, you are going to learn how to do a knit stitch today. As always, I have timestamps in the description box so you can skip around to any portion of the video you may like to watch. There may be times today where I'm sharing more information than you want or you are ready for. And if that's the case, put a pin in it and skip on to something else you'd rather see. I want this video to be a resource for you, not just today, but tomorrow in the future, so that if at some point you're like, wait a minute, I do need that piece of information, you can always come back and know that it's here and you can find it. So with all that said, grab some yarn, grab some needles, and let's knit. Here are two swatches of fabric that I made that represent some of the most basic stitch patterns you can have in knitting. This here is garter stitch. This is what you're going to be knitting when you learn how to do the knit stitch, because when it's knitted flat, it's comprised of all knit stitches. This here, right up here, this is called stockinette. Stockinette is a fabric when knitted flat that's comprised of a combination of a knit row and then doing a purl row. So this is actually a little bit more advanced of a fabric. So these fabrics look very different. But if I were to isolate just one row from each of these fabrics, that row would look remarkably similar. This is what every row of knitting looks like. It looks like just a wave. Here's what a stitch looks like when it is isolated away from everything else. There's basically 5 segments of this stitch. There is the right running thread, the right leg, the purl bump, the left leg, and the left running thread. The way knitting is created is to draw loops of yarn through one another so that we're stabilizing that wave of yarn, and you get this amazing interlocking waves of yarn that create these beautiful fabrics. But they're interlocked together in different ways to create different looking fabrics. I mean, that's so cool. I think that's cool. If you watched my first episode of Knitting Fundamentals, I showed these ginormous plastic needles. I'm like, I never knit with these. Well, I have knitted with them. This is just the beginning of a very large swatch. And I did this so you can really see what's going on. So when the stitches are on the needle like this, it can be hard to identify the various sections of the stitch. So let's just take a moment to identify those sections. So here, this is the right leg on the front of the needle. This is the purl bump on the top of the needle, and then behind the needle right here is the left leg. These stitches are currently mounted on the needle in what's called a Western style mount. There is another way to mount the stitches, which is the Eastern mounted stitch. And the only difference is the right leg is on the back of the needle and the left leg is to the front of the needle. But that's something we're not going to worry about right now. The way we're going to learn how to knit is using the Western style mount. So if you're ever looking at your stitches and you're confused, like which one's the right leg, remember knitting is always done right to left and your legs always go right to left. So what I mean by that is if you look closely, I'm going to take this off here. If you look closely, I'm going to pull this down. You can see this right leg sits just ahead of the left leg behind it. All right, so the right leg is always leading the left leg. If I were to turn this around, now the right leg is in back and the left leg is in front. Notice that right leg, it's ahead of the left leg. So that's how you can always identify your right leg and your left leg. Right now, this undulation of yarn that's wrapped around this needle is unsupported. These are known as live stitches, but I'm going to do something you normally never do when you're knitting. I'm going to take my needle out. But I want to take them out for a reason, because I want you to clearly see how I'm going to take these stitches and pull yarn through them so that they become knit stitches. All right, so here are my loops of yarn. Notice all the stitches are nice and open. That's important. And here's my right leg, here's my left leg, here's my purl bump. And actually right there you can see, because this edge stitch is loose, you can see my right running thread. If I pull those apart right there, that's the left running thread. So, but we want to be careful because these stitches are live and they're unsupported. Imagine my finger is a needle, and what you do is you take your needle and it goes in front of the right leg like this, and it goes behind the left leg. Then the needle, it can't grab because needles aren't articulating like my finger is, but you grab the yarn with your needle and you pull it through. And look, I just created a stitch with my finger. But that's basically what the knit stitch is. It's taking the yarn that's in the back of the work and it's pulling it through the loop to the front of the work like that. Something really important to note right now. And this is one of those pieces of information that may not be important to you now, but becomes important later as you learn more about knitting, which is when you insert your needle, to keep your stitches nice and open and untwisted, you always have it where your needle goes in front of the right leg and behind the left leg. So there are lots of ways to utilize your needles to do what I just did with my fingers. There's lots of ways to knit, and people are very passionate about how they knit. I'm very passionate about my method of knitting. Two styles of knitting that you see most often is what's called English knitting, also called throwing, and continental knitting, also called picking. In English knitting, I tension my yarn in my right hand. And tensioning your yarn is just a fancy way of saying I wrap the yarn in my right hand so I can control it. We'll go over more about tensioning your yarn in another segment. And all you do is you use your right hand to throw the yarn to wrap it and do your stitches. In continental knitting, you tension your yarn in your left hand, and it's more of a picking motion. So you just insert your needle and pick the yarn, pull it through those loops. If you crochet, holding that yarn in your left hand is going to feel very natural to you. The way I'm going to teach knitting, however, is using lever style. And the reason is it's my favorite way to knit. It's how I'm most comfortable knitting, and I'm a big proponent of it. And if I can convert anybody to lever knitting, I'm going to try to do it. So the way that I explain lever knitting is it's a variation of English knitting. You are still holding the yarn in your right hand, but the difference is you hold the needle in your right hand still. And so you use your left hand to load stitches on and off of your right needle. And what I like about this way of knitting is the work is evenly distributed between both hands. For me, I have found this way of knitting to cause me the least amount of hand fatigue and wrist pain, which is really important if you do a lot of knitting. If for any reason you think you'd prefer learning how to knit continental, whether you're a crocheter, you think you'd feel more comfortable holding the yarn in your left hand, you're left-handed, you think that would feel more natural to you, whatever it may be. There's many resources on YouTube showing how to knit continental. I'll provide some links in the description box below. But if you want to learn to knit how I knit, cast on 20 to 30 stitches, because it's time to learn how to do the knit stitch. A note for left-handed people learning how to knit. I have great news for you. You don't have to learn how to knit any differently than a person who is right-handed. Like typing, knitting is a two-handed activity, so you just have to learn how to knit. You don't need to adjust your actions. But just know, if you're left-handed and learning to knit and this stuff is feeling really awkward and uncomfortable, don't worry. Everybody, when they first learn to knit, feels awkward and uncomfortable. Let's work on picking up our needles. Really, we have to think about this? Just a little bit. This won't take long, I promise. Knitting is an activity that's generally done from right to left. So the needle that has your stitches on them that you're going to work goes in your left hand, and you just hold this with an overhand grip. And then there's your empty needle, and that goes in your right hand. Most knitters are taught to hold the needle overhand in the knife grip. However, that's not how I knit. The way I knit is to utilize something called the pencil grip. The needle is balanced in the crook of your thumb right here, and then your thumb and your forefinger just lightly touch either side of the needle and act as guardrails just to keep this stable. In lever knitting, you do not move your right needle. All right, and holding your needle like this in a pencil grip really aids in keeping this right needle still so that you can use your left needle to move stitches on and off of this. When you're holding your needle in the pencil grip, your instinct is going to want to hold on to the needle for dear life because that needle could just jump out of your hand and run away. That's natural. You're just learning how to knit, and when we're first learning how to do something, our instinct tends to be to tense everything up. I really encourage you to work on keeping your right hand relaxed and trusting that that needle is going to stay nice and secure in your right hand. Think of the needle as a delicate egg that if you squeeze too hard, it could break. Some of that loosening up of your right hand will come with time and practice as you get more comfortable with this, but it's just something to be aware of, trying to develop good habits right from the beginning. All that being said, the pencil grip can feel unnatural to people, and the knife grip can feel very natural. If you prefer the knife grip, that's fine. You can totally learn how to knit the way that I knit utilizing the knife grip, and I'll show you how that works in the next section when we talk about tensioning yarn. All tensioning yarn is how you hold your yarn in your hand. Now, some English knitters, the way they do this is they just hold the yarn in their right hand like this. I really encourage you not to do this. The way to ideally hold your yarn, however, is to actually tension the yarn through your fingers. And this does a couple things. One, it helps you keep good even tension on the yarn as you knit, which is important. It also makes it easier to throw the yarn, actually. So here's how I like to tension my yarn for lever knitting. You bring your middle finger up underneath the yarn, twist around, okay? And then you bring your ring finger over the working yarn that's between your middle finger and the needle. And then you just flip your hand over, all right? Now, sometimes when you're first learning how to tension your yarn, this doesn't feel secure enough. Something you can do is just take your forefinger and twist it around a second time. That's going to give you more control over the yarn. The only downside of doing this is the yarn doesn't move as easily through your fingers, but when you're first learning how to knit, having a sense of control is more important. If you want to utilize the knife grip when you're knitting, slight variation to how I just tensioned my yarn. I'm still going to bring my middle finger up underneath the yarn, twist around, bring my ring finger over the top of the yarn between my middle finger and the needle, and flop my hand over like this. But I'm going to bring my forefinger underneath that yarn, like that. So that's only if you're using the knife grip. So now you know how to hold your needles, you know how to tension your yarn. Let's put it all together and do our first knit stitches. Very exciting, yes. Needle with the stitches go in the left hand. Then I'm going to tension my yarn. So my yarn is tensioned, and then I place my needle in my right hand. Whenever you do the knit stitch, you're bringing the needle in front of the right leg and through the left leg. And how you do this with lever knitting is, I'm going to take my left needle and I'm going to bring it up behind my right needle so those two tips are touching, and the right needle is sitting between the first and second stitch of the left needle. This is position 1. Throughout this motion, I'm going to keep those tips touching, by the way. Now I need to get this right needle inserted into this first stitch. The way I'm going to do this is actually by moving my left needle. I'm going to take my left needle, move it away from me, around the tip of the right needle, and back. Now my left needle is sitting atop the right needle, and the right needle is through the stitch. This is position 2. It's kind of magical the way it just sort of will happen. Now I can wrap my yarn to create a new stitch. So when I wrap my yarn, I'm going to move my right hand in a counterclockwise motion. So I'm going to take my right hand and I'm going to move it to the left so the yarn comes underneath the right needle and then over the top of the right needle. Now I've wrapped my yarn. To finish the stitch, I now have to unload this stitch on the left needle. To do that, I'm going to move my left needle away from me, around the tip of the right needle, and back to position 1. Then I can move my left needle out. Boom. Just created my first stitch of knitting. Something really important right now I want to point out is it's really important when you create a new stitch that you make sure that stitch gets pushed back to the full circumference of the needle so that you're properly sizing the stitch. This is one of those good habits to get into so you can create good tension. Now I broke that down into very small parts so you could just clearly see what's going on, and I'm going to do it again, but I'm going to explain it a little faster. Again, I'm going to bring my left needle up behind my right needle so the two tips are touching. The right needle is sitting between the first and second stitch of the needle. I'm going to keep my tips touching as I move the left needle away from me, around the tip of the needle, and back into the second position. So to wrap my yarn, I'm going to move my hand counterclockwise so my hand goes to the left so the yarn comes underneath the needle and over the top of the right needle. Now I'm going to move my left needle back to position 1 by sliding it along the right needle, around the tip and back, and I just take my left needle out. And I've done the second stitch. And I make sure those both stitches go to the full circumference of the needle so these new stitches are properly sized. One more time. Left needle into position 1. Move the left needle away from me and around the tip of the right needle so I come into position 2. I wrap my yarn counterclockwise, and then I move my left needle back to position 1, out. I'm going to pick up some speed so you can see what this starts to look like when you get comfortable knitting this way. I'm still going pretty slowly for myself. This first row of knitting can be kind of tricky because, well, first of all, you're still getting comfortable with everything, but also you're working your cast on stitches. Those cast on stitches sometimes can be just a squidge tighter than the rest of your knitting. That's okay. Just keep trying to do it. So there I've completed an entire row of knitting. To set up for knitting my next row, I'm going to turn my needle and have it in my left hand. So here's all those stitches I just created. You can see this purl bumps here, all right? Those purl bumps are from the stitches that I knitted into, and here are all my new stitches. To get ready to knit another row, I'm going to just, again, pick up my empty needle, put that in my right hand, and I can start knitting. For everybody who's learning how to knit, I want to assure you of something. This is all going to feel very weird when you first start to do it, and it's going to feel awkward, and you're going to feel fumbly, and it might be frustrating. Please do not get frustrated with yourself. That experience you are having is perfectly normal because you're manipulating your muscles in new ways and you're having to build up muscle memory, and it just takes time and persistence. What you need to do now is just start working on creating those knit stitches over and over again. Your stitches may not look uniform, you may not have good tension, you might be sitting there going, oh my God, this looks terrible. Don't worry about any of that right now. All you need to worry about right now, or I should say, all you need to focus on right now is getting comfortable doing those motions so that you can create the knit stitches. So I just want to quickly go over some things you may run into while you're knitting and how might you want to deal with them, or more likely not deal with them for right now. When I first started to learn to knit, a mistake that I would often make without even realizing I was doing it was I would have this yarn in my right hand, and as I would go to knit my first stitch, I would actually take the yarn and bring it over the top of my left needle, and that would actually capsize this first stitch, and then you accidentally knit 2 stitches into 1 stitch. And the effect of that was I would start off with 20 stitches and then all of a sudden I'd have 21 stitches on my needle. So with your yarn, when you're doing the knit stitch, you want to make sure you're keeping the yarn down underneath their needle and towards the back of the work and not bringing it over the top like this. Another common mistake that happens when you first learn to knit, I'm going to just do a couple of stitches here, is to do an errant yarn over. Yarn overs is when you take your yarn and you bring it over the needle and then knit, and then you have this little piece of yarn over that you can knit into and create a hole. This is how actually lace knitting is done, is with yarn overs. The errant yarn over normally happens because you, without realizing it, have brought the yarn to the front of the work, and then when you go to knit, all of a sudden you have this additional stitch. So if you're knitting, you're practicing your stitches and you look at your work and you see a hole in the middle of it, you probably accidentally did a yarn over. The way to avoid the errant yarn over is, again, while you're knitting, making sure that you're keeping this yarn to the back of the work. As you're learning to do this, after every row, go ahead and count your stitches and see if you have a consistent number of stitches. If you're maintaining a consistent number of stitches, that's awesome, because first-time knitters, a lot of times, we don't keep a consistent number of stitches. And if you have suddenly extra stitches, it's probably because either you've capsized that first stitch on the needle or you have an errant yarn over. Now, let's say you've counted your stitches and you actually have 1 less stitch than what you started off with. Well, in that case, you have probably dropped a stitch without realizing it. See right there? That looks all crazy. I dropped a stitch there. If you drop a stitch, normally that's when you would do a repair. However, what you're working on right now is just a practice swatch. And so what I'm actually going to recommend you do is, if you drop a stitch, if you make any mistake, don't worry about it, keep moving. But if you drop a stitch, grab a stitch marker. Do I have one near me? Darn it. I had to go grab a stitch marker. It was on the floor. When you become an avid knitter, you're always finding stitch markers on the floor. So anyway, take a locking stitch marker and just bloop, put it on that stitch and let it hang out. If you find that you have a hole in your knitting, or suddenly you have more stitches than what you started off with, again, I would not worry about that right now. Just go, okay, that's my new stitch count, and keep working on that knit stitch, because that's really the most important thing that you need to do right now. When you get to a section of knitting where you're feeling really comfortable physically doing the work and you're getting a consistent stitch count, that means that you're not dropping stitches, you're not doing yarn overs, you're not capsizing any stitches. You know at that point that you have figured out and gotten pretty good at doing the knit stitch. At that point, you'll be ready to learn the next stitch, which is the purl stitch. In the next video, I'm going to go over how you can actually end this practice swatch by discussing casting off, and I'm going to go a little bit more in depth in terms of garter stitch, how you can read it, how you can count your rows, how you can make repairs if you do drop a stitch in garter, because it's a little complicated, but I'm confident we can do this together. If you have any questions about anything I said today, please let me know in the comments below. I'd be happy to try to answer them. Also, you can find me on various social media. That's all down in the description box. I hope you found this video helpful. If so, please give it a thumbs up. And if you want to keep following along in this series of videos, please subscribe to my channel and hit the notification bell, which will let you know whenever I upload a new video. I hope you have a wonderful day, evening, weekend, whenever you may be watching this, and as always, happy knitting! Bye! If you've been following along with the knitting, alright, come on, get up, get up. If you see this little nick on my thumb, that's because I just had to do a battery change. And I'm not kidding, the battery went flying under this cabinet that's right here. And so I was it was a whole thing. It was a whole mess. It was a mess. Anyway, garter stitch. And that is the stitch pattern you're working when all you're doing is knitting knits. And you just keep knitting along. Doop, 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 doop. Knit, 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 knit. I'm knitting, yes indeed. I need to pause this and reset myself because I'm babbling at this point.